Hi there guys, tonight we start with the extraordinary lives and remarkable resilience of medieval peasants. The everyday heroes who, no matter the chances, controlled to survive some of the coldest and maximum brutal nights in records, from makeshift insulation tricks to communal dozing strategies. Their story is one among grit, ingenuity, and backbone. So before you get cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, however simplest, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me realize inside the remarks in which you are tuning in from, and what time it's far for you. It is constantly captivating to see who's joining us from around the arena. Now, dim the lighting fixtures, maybe activate a fan for that gentle heritage hum, and allow us ease into tonight's adventure together. While you think of medieval existence, you may think jousting nights, grand feasts, and merry festivals. But for the common peasant, wintry weather become much less about merit and greater approximately how do we now not die this night. It wasn't just a season. It changed into a check of persistence that came around every wire, like a mainly cruel teacher who failed to trust in second possibilities. Image this. You are living in a tiny dust and stick hut with walls so thin you can possibly pay attention a chicken sneeze from outdoor. No insulation. No home windows except you depend a small hole filled with animal paws and skin, and truly no thermostat wars along with your siblings. The inner temperature of your own home was generally only a polite couple of tiers above whatever the climate become doing outside. If it become freezing exterior, it become politely barely less freezing inner. Congratulations. Nights had been the worst. Darkness swallowed the entirety. The wind howled like an irritated ghost, and the fire in the fireplace sputtered pathetically, doing its fine, but on the whole simply roasting the feet of whoever was sitting closest. In case you have been on the other facet of the room, sorry, you may as well have been camping outdoor with worse snacks. Apparel wasn't a whole lot assist both. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had more than one difficult spun wool tunics, perhaps a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a desire that layering them could turn you into a few type of human onion. Spoiler, it did not really work, and neglect approximately snuggling underneath gentle quilts. Beds have been frequently nothing more than sacks filled with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for excellent degree, and bonus, a few fleas for additional company. Luxury, they call his medieval peasant existence. The bloodless wasn't simply uncomfortable, it became risky. Frostbite, hypothermia, and well-known freezing to loss of life have been regular dangers, mainly for young kids and the elderly. Every morning that you wakened, nevertheless, breathing turned into taken into consideration a minor miracle, and definitely worth celebrating, perhaps with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So sure, surviving a medieval wintry weather wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling along with your cattle, and praying you did not wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure, it was simply beginning. If you think your rental is drafty due to the fact the window does not close nicely, medieval peasants would really like a word. Their houses were not simply drafty. They were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Maximum peasant houses have been what historians cautiously call wall and daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a massive basket smeared with a charming aggregate of dust, straw, and animal dung. Sure, dung. They were not looking to be gross. Dung became a reasonably priced, sticky insulator. Plus, it changed into usually effortlessly available. Let's consider. Those partitions, regardless of how lovingly smeared, did not stand a whole lot hazard against a proper iciness hurricane. The bloodless wind found every crack, each hole, and gleefully danced its manner into the only room homes, swirling around and ensuring you by no means got too comfortable. Privacy, clearly now not. Warmth no longer without a doubt. Person building, definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs seemed picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and once in a while permit inside the nearby natural world. Not anything says first class evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, in the event that they existed at all, have been laughably tiny and usually included with thin animal hides or wood shutters. Glass became so high-priced that even the lord of the manor probable couldn't afford more than an unmarried tiny acre, and peasants. They were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide proper off the wall mid-snowfall. To make subjects worse, flooring have been regularly simply compacted dust. Whilst it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the floor, so technically you can say they had indoor water functions. Not that they preferred it. In winter, each step into your own home ought to experience like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from under, bloodless from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault to your frame warmth. However, medieval peasants were not the kind to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled near every different. Human insulation at its finest, creativity, stubbornness, and a chunk of sheep grace rubbed into the walls were often the most effective thing status between them, and turning into medieval popsicles. Because if your private home became falling apart, and your first-rate safety towards the elements concerned mud and goat hair, properly, at least you may snort about it. Type of in case your enamel weren't chattering too tough. As though the freezing air wasn't sufficient, medieval peasants additionally needed to war a silent enemy rising from underneath. The frozen ground itself. Floors were not absolutely flooring again then. They had been simply barely flatter patches of earth inside your own home. Perhaps if you had been lucky, someone had thrown down a few straw or antique rushes to present you the phantasm of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted again away from the cold, tough dust. And oh, that bloodless turned into relentless. It seeped up from the earth, like an evil little ghost worming its manna, through the straw into your bones, and straight into your very soul. If you dropped something onto the ground at some point of a wintry weather night, congratulations. It became now a part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants attempted to combat this grim struggle in some methods. One technique turned into layering thick mats of straw throughout the ground, if you can come up with the money for it. Or extra realistically, if you could borrow sufficient of it from your neighbour's subject without getting stuck. You may have a first-rate insulating barrier, but straw flattened rapid, got mouldy even faster, and introduced an additional crunchy soundtrack on your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt as a substitute. Every now and then, they would throw sparkling rushes on top without cleansing out the antique ones. Over time, this created a charming surroundings of decomposing plant life, fleas, and anything mystery creatures determined to move in. It became essentially medieval carpet padding, in case your carpet was alive, barely damp, and smelled like a wet canine. Beds, for people who had them, didn't solve lots. They had been commonly little more than timber frames packed with, you guessed it, extra straw or hay. Instead of secure mattresses, you had poking, transferring, crunchy layers that did little towards the bloodless radiating from beneath. Tossing and turning wasn't approximately consolation. It became a determined, awkward dance to hold blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The fact is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy floor a lot, as learn how to live uncomfortably above it. An amazing nighttime sleep wasn't approximately desires or softness. It became about waking up with all your feet nonetheless connected. And if you could pull that off, good day, you have been doing better than most. If medieval houses had an unmarried hero all through wintry weather, it wasn't the roof or the partitions, or maybe the brave layers of dust and dung insulation. It turned into the fireplace, a crackling, cussed hearth pit that served as the only actual defense towards the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval lifestyles. On the middle of nearly every peasant home became an easy hearth. No fireplace with an elaborate stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Alternatively, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and sufficient smoke pouring into the room to make you surprise in case you had been slowly becoming a ham. It truly is proper. Maximum houses didn't actually have chimneys. Smoke simply sort of did its satisfactory. It drifted out through small holes within the roof, cracks in the partitions, or proper into your lungs if it became feeling lazy that night. It wasn't perfect for respiration or your normal lifespan, but on the brilliant face it did a tremendous job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted visitors. Who needs pest control while you're marinating in smoke 247? The fireplace wasn't just about warm temperature, either. It was the kitchen, the light supply, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. Human beings sat across the fireplace telling testimonies, gossiping, or simply staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't tons else to do after sunset. Preserving the hearth alive wasn't just a pleasant concept. It became mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night turned into like putting up a sign for the cold to are available in and end you off. Plus, reigniting a fireplace in iciness wasn't as easy as hanging a healthy. You had to work with flint, metal, kindling, and greater prayers than you'd ever presented earlier than. Absolutely everyone inside the family had a responsibility. Stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or if you had been lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It became a steady battle between human staying power and the smothering bloodlust that wanted not anything extra than to snuff you out. The fire didn't guarantee survival. However, without it, survival became downright not possible. It was a smoky, sputtering, regularly disappointing little fire. But in a medieval iciness, it changed into the thrashing heart of hope. If there has been one component medieval peasants feared extra than running out of oil, it was letting the fireplace go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold could creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And within the dead of iciness, restarting a hearth from scratch wasn't just inconvenient. It could be deadly. Suits didn't exist, but lighters dream on. Rekindling a hearth intended putting flint and metal together, praying for an unmarried valuable spark, and then coddling that spark with soft love and something dry kindling you hadn't already burned days in the past. Consider looking to do all this inside the freezing dark, half of asleep with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for additional motivation. So peasants were given smart. They banked the fireplace. No, now not in a secure savings account. Banking meant cautiously burying the embers below a mound of ash proper earlier than mattress. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the sparkling coals and keeping them alive, just slightly until morning. If you did it right, you could walk over at sunrise, poke the pile a bit, upload sparkling wood, and voila, fireplace without the frostbite. But if you did it incorrect, properly, permits just say mornings were given an entire lot colder and a whole lot fussier. Firebanking turned into an artwork surpassed down from determined to toddler like a prized circle of relatives recipe. All and sundry had their very own little secrets and techniques. Some stated use dry ash only. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight. Others allow them to breathe. You can practically begin a medieval argument just by way of suggesting a better firebanking approach. It was the historic version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with barely higher survival stakes. Every now and then banking the fire wasn't sufficient. A howling wind may sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway, or an inept sheep may stumble into the fire. Sure, it happened. This is why some households took turns getting up within the night to check the coals, essentially the medieval equal of sleepwalking to the thermostat. Ultimately, firebanking became less about learning nature and extra about buying only some more treasured hours of heat. And if you awakened to even an unmarried surviving ember, that changed into your victory right there, and sufficient to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase, "the extra the merrier," wasn't just about parties. It became a wintry weather survival tactic. While the hearth sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through each crack, there was one surefire supply of warmth. Every different. And if that intended drowsing cheek to cheek together with your entire own family, neighbors, farm animals, and likely a completely stressed goose, so be it. Forget about approximately personal space. Privateness wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the aim wasn't consolation. It changed into don't wake up frozen to the ground. Whole households piled into the warmest nook of the residence, wrapped in anything scraps of material they could find, and fashioned what should best be defined as a desperate, loud night-breathing human lasagna. More youthful kids squeezed in among parents, grandparents snuggled below the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up, well, there was usually room for one extra. If you have been fortunate, you brought to sleep within the center, where body heat radiated from all facets. In case you have been unlucky, you were on the threshold, the medieval equivalent of drowsing subsequent to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the individual that moved an excessive amount of in the course of the night time. You shift once to get cozy, and you've got knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by using the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Every so often even bedding changed into shared, a communal straw bed that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of more than one generations. And because hygiene wasn't precisely triumphing any awards returned then, permits just say it wasn't the maximum aromatic snoozing association, but higher, while it's you versus frostbite, you Forrestal being picky. Frame warmness wasn't just satisfactory, it changed into strategic. A few medieval publications even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people at the out-of-doors of the institution, like human shields towards the bloodless. Toddlers and frail elders had been tucked deep inside the center, handled like the treasured little heat mills they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Through the years, it had become part of everyday lifestyles, part of own family bonding. Long iceness nights huddled collectively caused storytelling, singing, and absolutely some very thrilling conversations muffled beneath a shared wool blanket. So, subsequent time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just do not forget. At the least you're now not preventing for elbow area among a loud night-breathing uncle and a mainly judgmental goat. In case you thought present-day roommates had been a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically something with a pulse and a little bit of frame warmness. Bringing animals interior wasn't only a quirky village way of life, it became crucial for survival. Farm animals generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hevel, wherein the wind howled louder than your belly, every little diploma mattered. Plus, in case your goat shared a wall with you, it becomes slightly less possibly to get stolen by means of a neighbor inside the lifeless of night. 2 birds, 1 smelly stone. At night time, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted close to the fire, and cows lounged luxuriously towards the partitions, chewing cud like they paid lease. It wasn't glamorous. A ways from it. In case you've ever been caught in an automobile on a summertime avenue ride with someone who forgot to bathe, consider that. But it is a cow, it's wintry weather, and there is actually nowhere else to go. The smell's legendary. With the aid of springtime, the fragrance of a shared iciness was something fierce. You didn't want to light a candle. Your nostrils have been already on a wild experience. However, medieval peasants advanced a selective nose. They failed to whinge tons because they knew one uncomfortable fact. The more animals internal, the fewer frozen empty inside the morning. Certain animals even had high spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, typically took center level close to the circle of relatives. Goats were allowed nearer in for their warm temperature, and due to the fact goats, being goats, could discover a way interior besides. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, properly pigs, failed to care. They plopped down anywhere they pleased, probable proper inside the center of the floor. Of root, sharing your bedroom with farm animals wasn't without risks. Believe drifting off peacefully handiest to be rudely woke up via a chicken determining your hair makes an awesome perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first issue in the morning. Sure, medieval mornings will be complete of surprises. Nonetheless, in spite of the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the easy math. Cold kills and cows cuddle whether or not they want to or no longer. Inside the conflict in opposition to winter's icy hands, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath become often the identifying thing between existence and death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking appropriate. It became approximately no longer demise. Peasants weren't flipping through the contemporary developments. They have been layering up like they have been getting ready for war, in opposition to the bleak reaper himself. The rule was simple. In case you owned it, you wore it. Once in a while abruptly. First, the primary below tunic, a scratchy, possibly now not too clean linen blouse. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then some other, in case you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and in case you were without a doubt lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on pinnacle like a prize trophy. Congratulations, You are now approximately 10% warmer and 9% itchier. Boots have been a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their toes in layers of cloth or antique rags and filled them into wooden clogs. If the bloodless nonetheless bit through, well, you simply introduced any other rag and was hoping you failed to lose a toe. And neglect about washing these types of layers. Washing your garments within the center of winter, suppose dragging them to a frozen floe, smashing through the ice, after which waiting 2 days to your most effective blouse to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a sad blouse cycle, maximum peasants accurately determined that smelling like a mixture of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small charge to pay for now not freezing stable. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had an advantage feature insulation. That grimy layer locked in body warmth. It became like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and a ways much less socially acceptable these days. Hats, scarves, and gloves have been prized treasures. A easy woolen cap should imply the distinction among making it via the night time, or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves have been regularly homemade from whatever scraps of leather or cloth humans could scourge, on occasion looking extra like unhappy puppet costumes than whatever stylish. Youngsters have been mainly swaddled till they resembled overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The purpose was to entice as an awful lot valuable frame warmness as feasible. Style, beauty, by no means heard of them. Warmth turned into the real medieval flex. So the following time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, simply recollect medieval peasants walked around wearing one broy to their dresser at once, searching like lumpy laundry luggage and counting themselves fortunate for it. Inside the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was nearly a survival device, because it seems getting dirty wasn't a signal you had given up on life. It changed into tactical, strategic, dare we are saying genius. See, winter posed a completely unique problem. Warmth loss. Clean clothes, specifically freshly laundered linen, have been highly horrible at keeping you heat. They had been breathable, certain, but while the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't precisely a promoting factor. It truly is in which dust got herein. As peasants trudged via day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime. Natural body oils and A8TA4L79Fe4BX443CB2 mud started out to build up on their tunics, cloaks and leggings. Over the years, this herbal armor clogged the tiny gaps inside the material, making garments more wind-resistant. It became like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Certain, you smelled like a goat who lost a guess, but wager what, you had been warm. In reality, a few medieval folks believed that washing yourself too frequently in iciness may want to actually make you ill. Better to keep that shielding holy filth barrier intact. Bathing became uncommon, laundry even rarer, and soap, whilst it existed, became reserved for extreme events like whilst the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their garments without changing those under. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Sooner or later, you became a on-foot museum of the beyond 6 weeks, each stain telling the heroic tale of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. To out-of-doors observers, medieval peasants may have looked and smelled like that they had absolutely given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic changed into a thermal shield towards dying by way of frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither turned into freezing to demise, because you wanted to smell like plants. Besides, in a global wherein literally anybody stank to excessive heaven, you were not offending everyone. Nostril blindness changed into practically a manner of life. So yes, in medieval winters, dust wasn't failure. It became fashion. It became function. And in case you had a thick, greasy outer layer by way of February, you, my pal, were prevailing at existence. If you notion medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, suppose, once more. The fact was a chunk more rustic, and by way of rustic I mean allows sleep on a pile of useless vegetation and wish for the best. Beds inside the medieval peasant international were commonly a rough timber frame, if you may find the money for one covered with a huge sack crammed complete of straw, hay, or vintage rushes. It truly is it, no reminiscence foam, no orthopedic help, no 5 famous person lodge revel in. Just a crunchy, lumpy, barely pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Each toss and flip in the night time delivered a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stork. A few peasants even skipped the timber frame altogether and just threw the straw instantly onto the dirt floor, developing a costly groundle napping revel in that contemporary influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected shut-eye. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they had been transient. Through the years the straw flattened, grew mouldy, attracted bugs, and commonly became an organic risk region. Converting the straw became a large occasion, typically completed a few times a 12 months in case you had been diligent, or each time your mattress commenced actively transferring without your permission. Rushes have been a famous alternative. Those long grasses had been unfolded thick at the floor, on occasion combined with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odor-cattle aroma of everyday existence. Sparkling rushes smelled cute for approximately an afternoon. After that, they became a part of the muddy, trampled landscape within the house, mixing seamlessly with dust, food scraps, and something else wandered in, and permits no longer neglect the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other fascinating critters loved straw bedding nearly as lots because the peasants did. If you awakened scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You have been living the authentic medieval experience. Notwithstanding the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided an essential insulating layer towards the frozen earth, and clumping collectively atop them created a wallet of shared body warmness, medieval important heating at its finest. So subsequent time you sink into your smooth, supportive mattress. Simply don't forget somewhere available a medieval peasant is calling down at you from records, grinning via a mouthful of lacking tooth, and pronouncing, "Must be nice." While you live in a residence made from sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly analyze that iciness breezes are not just a nuisance, they are non-public assaults. Medieval peasants didn't just combat the cold from the out of doors. They fought it from inner their personal houses, armed with nothing however anything they might cram into the cracks. And agree with me, there have been a variety of cracks. Partitions warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold appeared to discover new places to sneak in each night time, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house had become an art form. Peasants crammed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of antique cloth, bundles of dry grass, and occasionally even animal hair. If it became tender, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it turned into jammed right into a hole somewhere. A few in particular decided souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the out-of-doors of their walls as an annual wintry weather mission. Believe standing there in freezing climate, slapping bloodless manure onto your personal residence even as muttering, "This is fine. This is luxurious," because in a manner it became. Roof leaks were some other battlefield. Thatch, whilst cheap and abundant, wasn't precisely waterproof. Mainly after a few seasons of rain and snow, peasants might plug holes in the roof with spare bits of material, bundles of reeds, or in moments of actual desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the closest area. Every home subsequently started out to appear to be a barely unhappy patchwork cover made with the aid of a person who gave up halfway through. Doors, home windows. If you had them, you had been fortunate. However, even then, they have been little more than wooden planks, hung via iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes had been often included with animal hides, or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts, and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the dwelling area. Every night become a war between human ingenuity and the relentless sneaky bloodless. One minute you had been heat, the following minute a sudden gust might discover the one spot you overlooked, slapping you conscious like a frosty hand of doom. But in some way, via cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to simply accept, slightly frozen, as an everlasting state of being, medieval peasants patched, filled, and muddled their manna through the worst winters nature may want to throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you wide awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend absolutely everyone's dozing immediately. As a substitute, they evolved a survival strategy that nowadays might make any Navy commander proud: sound asleep in shifts. It wasn't a few grand prepared gadget with whistles and roll calls. It turned into a ways simpler and much greater desperate. 1W2 the household stayed unsleeping, tending to the hearth and patching up stray drafts, whilst the opposite 1W2 curled up below threadbare blankets and hay, looking to seize a few valuable hours of half of frozen sleep. The fireplace needed steady attention. Left alone, it might die down, and restarting it, take into account, changed into approximately as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to bop. So, someone had to be on Ember Patrol, and due to the fact that no person desired to arise after they were eventually warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, were given elbowed unsleeping, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke prod and curse the fireplace back to life while attempting now not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There had been no night imaginative and prescient goggles, no past due nighttime snacks, and sincerely no 5 greater min snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a developing resentment towards whoever snored loudest all through your shift. Youngsters antique enough to maintain a stick were pressed into carrier, getting to know early that during wintry weather, every person pulled their weight or froze attempting. Grandparents on occasion stayed via the fire longer, both due to their experience and admittedly because arthritis made mendacity down and getting up again an enormous event. And while it changed into your turn to sleep, good fortune with people shifting about, animals rustling, wind battering the partitions, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who by chance rolled over too tough. Getting nice relaxation changed into a miracle. Yet, no matter the exhaustion, the machine labored, snoozing in shifts intended, that there has been usually a fixed of eyes and bloodless, begrudging fingers geared up to hold the fire alive. The embers survived, and through extension, so did the circle of relatives. So next time you grumble approximately waking up to alter the thermostat, or let the cat out, spare a concept for the medieval peasant squinting right into a smoking fireplace at 300 AM, wondering if fat had been definitely that important. In the end, you are aware of its cold, if you have to think about how you breathe simply to live alive. Medieval peasants failed to just war the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative napping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The hassle became simple. Deep open, mouthed respiration pulled icy air instantly into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia ought to kill you faster than you can say Hail Mary, that became a danger no person wanted to take. So, peasants found out the art of what you might call survival breathing. Rather than sucking in large gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their respiration shallow, slow, and most significantly, via the nose. The idea changed into to softly warm the incoming air a chunk before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it became higher than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a massive mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a price ticket to every week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul with no docks in sight, and grandma treating you with warm onion tea and company prayers. Some humans even tucked parts in their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, growing a makeshift breath warmer barrier. Of path, this also supposed you ended up with a humid, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging in your mouth via morning. But higher, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children had been taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold toddlers for panting like puppies indoors at some stage in the bloodless months. And certainly, between strict respiratory instructions, itchy wool layers, and drowsing next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval early life winters were individual building on a whole exclusive degree. At night time, tucked into straw bedding underneath piles of cloaks, and subsequent to a lightly steaming cow, respiration have become an art shape. Slow, constant, nose handiest, and as minimal as humanly viable, like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and less inspirational prices. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, however it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants persevered some other night within the long, relentless warfare in opposition to iciness. Within the infinite battle against medieval winter, peasants located an unlikely secret weapon, a full stomach. Seems one of the pleasant ways to combat off the cold wasn't some other scratchy wool cloak. it turned into stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy proper earlier than mattress. Energy supposed warm temperature. The extra your body needed to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal warmth, and maybe, just maybe, continue to exist till morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So, what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a protracted freezing nighttime? Think thick stews, heavy with root veggies like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains have been lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense chewy rye bread, in case you had been particularly fortunate, say after a festival day or a generous slaughter. You may even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't consolation food inside the Instagram feel. No sensitive presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It turned into one sizable, vaguely brown meal designed to sit down for your intestine like a friendly brick, slowly burning via the nighttime and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about ingesting loads. It changed into about eating smart. Meals that took longer to digest provided a gradual, regular trickle of warmth. Fatty meals were particularly praised, no longer just for the electricity they furnished, but because fats burn slower than lean meat. A stomach complete of stew bread and a questionable quantity of lard. Height medieval iciness luxury. Parents made certain even the pickiest kids ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas failed to like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night considering how an awful lot you overlooked the turnips. Harsh, however effective parenting, medieval style. Of path, heavy nighttime consuming came with its personal risks. You was probably warmer, but you had been also risking a nighttime of vivid, bizarre goals fueled by using a stomach trying desperately to process an entire area's worth of cabbages. Changed into it really worth it, simply. Because ultimately, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin superstar meal. They were aiming to live on. And if that intended going to mattress complete, bloated, and respiratory gently via your nostril next to a steaming cow, nicely, that was just any other nighttime within the ongoing quest to look some other frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants needed to get creative in the event that they desired a little greater warmth at bedtime, and that's how the standard haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone became Iceness's unsung heroes. Permits begin with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it honestly turned into. However, the idea became natural genius. Peasants would take a sturdy timber container, line it thickly with hay, and use it to shop food that had been cooked in advance, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, warm porridge, toss it into the hay field, cowl it up, and it stayed warm sufficient for an overdue nighttime snack without having to chance reigniting the fireplace. Medieval slow cookers, essentially. However, peasants failed to just stop at meals. They found out if hay could lure the heat from a stew pot, it could additionally trap the heat from something even higher. Rocks. Input the error of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, a person, probable whichever unfortunate toddler misplaced the family argument, could snatch a flat stone and chuck it into the coronary heart of the hearthfire. After roasting it till it was nearly too hot to the touch, a first-class line between beneficial and third-degree burn that they had fished out the use of a stick or a few old tongs. The stone, still radiating completely happy warmth, would be cautiously wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped beneath the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the mattress. A medieval heating pad geared up to do struggle towards the frozen earth. Of direction, there were risks. If you did not wrap the stone nicely, congratulations. You presently had a small localized residence fireplace, and in case you dropped it to your foot, nicely. Allows simply say wintry weather accidents were not continually because of slipping on ice. However, while the whole lot went proper, that stone furnished precious, comforting warm temperature that might final for hours. It wasn't steeply priced, but while you lived in a 1x2 frozen hut, luxury became described as no longer waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval Iceness survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous. However, for peasants clinging to whatever warmth they might find, it was a tiny miracle. In a medieval peasant's home, The fireplace wasn't simply where you prepare dinner. It was almost a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative member of the family, sure, however still surely important to survival, particularly while it got here time to sleep. The nearer you were to the fire, the higher your odds of waking up unfrozen. That supposed snoozing arrangements were much less about private desire and greater about strategic positioning. Toddlers, the elderly, and all people sick or frail were given first dibs on top real estate. Dad and Mom, older youngsters, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the hearth wasn't just kindness, it changed into simple survival math. Babies had been fragile heat mills, and elders have been valuable repositories of own family information, and permits be honest, the first-rate gossip. Shielding them with top warm temperature was non-negotiable. However, it wasn't all at ease toasting via the flames. Too close and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smouldering suspiciously. Two ways, and also you have been essentially camping in an ice container. It became a delicate dance. Stay close to sufficient to bask within the fire's glow. However, now not so close to which you needed to give an explanation for to your neighbor why you now seemed like a 1/2 cooked roast. The fireplace additionally didn't spread warm temperature frivolously. It in most cases roasted the human beings directly in the front of it, while absolutely everyone else fought over the slim cone of heat, like bloodless lizards jostling for a sunbeam. In case you were lucky sufficient to nod off facing the hearth, you would possibly have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so strong you can likely knock on it. Pets and farm animals of direction, muscled in too. A canine may wedge itself among you and the fireplace, tail wagging dangerously near open flame. Chickens every now and then perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, each shift of glowing embers become a tiny promise. You're still alive. You're nevertheless heat for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled via the hearth's pops and hisses, every breath forming small clouds within the frigid air past the hearth's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't at ease, however it became lifestyles, clinging to warm temperature through a thread of sparkling coals. Inside the medieval global, nobody survived wintry weather alone except they desired to turn out to be a very elegant frozen statue via January. Survival wasn't just a circle of relatives affair. It turned into a village undertaking, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where anybody's warm temperature and life depended on everybody else. The peasants knew that in the lifeless of iciness, a sturdy hearth and a pile of hay could simplest accomplish that a great deal. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth all of a sudden stopped curling into the sky, a person went to check. And now not just because Tom owed you a hen, even though that is probably a part of it, but because networks opposed survival. Villagers had unofficial iciness watchers, often the young or the aged, who could not paintings the fields, but could hold an eye fixed on who turned into coughing too difficult, who hadn't come to barter at the marketplace in a few days, or whose domestic looked a little too nevertheless within the morning frost. These humans had been the medieval version of community patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot greater sheep. If our own family's fireplace went out, it became a close to emergency. A very good neighbor could rush over with a sparkling coal bundled in rags, or better but, invite them into their very own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night time. Yes, it supposed squeezing an additional 4 bodies into an already cramped area. However, it became better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During in particular brutal winters, villagers from time to time pulled their ultimate salted meat, grain, and dried greens. It became grim charity. Nobody had an awful lot, but some communal food will be the difference among remarkable into spring or no longer. Even kids understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages whilst a person needed help. No person changed into too small or too worn, out whilst wintry weather came knocking. Positive. Medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds befell. Disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose top cooking pot in no way absolutely went away. However, when the nights grew deadly bloodless, Antique grudges had been frequently quietly shelved. In the end, a rival became nevertheless worth saving, due to the fact the following day it might be you desiring rescue. Inside the icy coronary heart of wintry weather, the village had become one big, stubborn-owned family. Every now and then dysfunctional, often hilarious, usually fiercely decided to continue to exist together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of wintry weather, they failed to just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed a lot. Due to the fact whilst the wind howled like wolves outdoor your paper-thin partitions, and the hearth shrank into sullen embers, you desired every viable gain, together with a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't only a Sunday affair again then. It became woven into each frozen breath. Earlier than crawling beneath layers of straw and scratchy wool, families could kneel together, presenting up moved quickly prayers to hold the fire burning, the roof intact, and their eft attached through mourning. Saints have become greater than remote holy figures. They have been wintry weather's frontline defense. Same, as an instance, changed into known as upon to guard towards throat illnesses. No longer a minor challenge whilst one mouthful of icy air ought to land you coughing up your soul. Saint Nicholas wasn't simply the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He turned into also asked to guard households from surprising wreck during the lean, lethal months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly round each day's survival. Some households sprinkled a touch holy water near the fire earlier than snoozing, hoping it might defend against evil spirits or not less than mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after positive banquet days, pleading for warmth and success to locate their way inner. Candles played a role too, unique vigil candles, regularly blessed by way of the nearby priest or the most pious vintage woman in the village, had been every now and then stored burning during the night, a flickering plea towards the cold darkness clawing at the partitions. And of rote, no severe winter prayer consultation become complete without a few promises. Expensive Lord, in case you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbour, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Religion wasn't some summary comfort. It became a day-by-day urgent verbal exchange. The peasants were not requesting luxury, just survival, a touch warmness, a touch food, and one greater day to muddle through till spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It turned into simple raw wish whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked beneath itchy blankets that by hook or by crook carried them through the infinite, cruel nights of iciness. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth became chilling. On occasion it wasn't enough, and whilst wintry weather gained, it didn't simply take some unlucky souls. It took whole families, complete villages, vanishing them into silence under a heavy shroud of snow and ice. A few winters have been specifically cruel, like the notorious exceptional famine iciness of 1315, when rains destroyed vegetation, farm animals starved, and freezing temperatures became an already brutal existence into a gradual, grinding catastrophe. Human beings were so desperate that tales whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and in the maximum frightening instances, every different. Failure to hold the hearth alive wasn't simply an inconvenience. It was regularly a demise sentence. Without the fire's meager warmth, households huddled together for the final time. Acquaintances might occasionally stumble throughout complete households in spring. Our bodies nevertheless locked in one another's frozen include, as if looking to percentage only a little extra warmness until the very stop. Houses themselves ought to disintegrate under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving manna in the center of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic, it was frequently fatal. Dragging yourself via thigh-deep snow to beg safe haven from friends wasn't a assure both, in particular if the one's friends were already stretched to the breaking factor. Disorder loved the bloodless too. Starvation weakened the frame, and cramped, smoky houses become breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and different deadly infections. A easy cough in December could effortlessly be a funeral by using January, after which there has been the quiet horror frostbite. Palms, toes, even ears blackened and died, while nevertheless connected to their owners. A few villagers survived winters on the price of their limbs. a grim badge of honor that said, "I made it through however Icinus took a piece of me." But what's maximum haunting isn't always simply the loss of life. It's the eerie normalcy of it. Humans familiar that each wintry weather, some amongst them wouldn't see the thaw. Its demise wasn't sudden. It became simply every other neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, ready its flip. Even amid the sour bloodless and regular danger, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life. Due to the fact as long as there has been one ember left in the fire, one breath placing inside the frozen air, there has been nonetheless a fight worth preventing. When we look lower back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frostbitten survivors of infinite winters, it is tempting to look only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen eft, the smoke-choked huts. However, buried under all that warfare is something a ways more effective, a legacy of uncooked, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable persistence. They did not have central heating, thermal jackets, or at ease memory foam mattresses. They did not even have the posh of assuming they'd continue to exist until spring. But what they did have, and what they left at the back of, become the blueprint for resilience. Each hasted mattress, each hand-banked fireplace, every moss-crammed wall gap become a testimony to human creativity below pressure. Faced with not possible odds, they did not disintegrate in despair. They tailored. They found out from the land, from every other, and from the bitter instructions carved through every brutal Icinus. Their groups had been constructed on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They taught each different to observe over the unwell, to tug resources whilst food ran low, to trust that supporting a freezing neighbour nowadays meant a person might assist you day after today. They lived by using the understanding that nobody beats winter by myself. Their religion, too, became a type of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, now not simply out of fear, but out of desire. Fragile, cussed desire that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Desire that when 100 darkish nights, spring could come again and lifestyles would find a way to push via the frozen floor. And by some means it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one extra night, one greater hurricane, destiny generations thrived. Bit by using frozen bit, they driven humanity ahead. Enduring winters their ancestors ought to slightly live to tell the tale until warm temperature and comfort became not unusual expectations rather than remote dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the lives we stay now. Each comfortable blanket, each heat house, every lazy Icinus evening spent sipping tea beneath tender lighting fixtures. All of its farther cease result of endless medieval peasants refusing to present into the cold. So the subsequent time the wind howls out of doors your double-pannied window, maybe spare a notion for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turn shivering survival right into a residing legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn did not come into the arena with a crown on her head or armies at her feet. Born around 1501, probably at Blickling Corridor or He Castle, she became the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, and bold diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noble female with effective circle of relatives' ties. Within the grand scheme of Tudor society, Anne's birth slightly stirred a ripple. But from these modest beginnings, something remarkable was taking root. A life that would at some point tilt the course of English records. From an early age, Anne becomes set apart no longer through her wealth, however through her thoughts. She becomes smart, spirited, and by all debts magnetic. Spotting her ability, her own family sent her abroad to the continent, where her education clearly started out. First, she served Margaret of Austria inside the glittering court of the Netherlands, an enjoy few English girls ought to dream of. There, Anne absorbed the artwork of international relations, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it became in France that Anne's brilliance turned into absolutely polished. She spent years inside the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of have an impact on beauty, flirtation, wit. Whilst other younger women perfected their embroidery, Anne mastered communication, intrigue, and the artwork of commanding interest without ever seeming to us searching for it. By the point she again to England inside the early 1520s, Anne turned into something rare, a lady who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers, even as carrying the ambition of a growing English residence. She wasn't a traditional splendor, even her admirers admitted as a good deal. However, she turned into arresting, dark eyes that sparked with intelligence, a short musical voice, a manner of shifting that suggested cause just slightly hid below layers of courtly grace. Anne failed to just input rooms, she modified their gravity. At a time when a girl's destiny become often sealed through start and marriage, Anne refused to flow quietly into obscurity. She had seen the strength that attraction and intellect should wield in foreign courts, and she or he intended to apply that information at domestic. Anne Boleyn became nevertheless a young female then, smart, ambitious, untested. But records became already beginning to stir around her. The girl who lower back to England turned into now not simply Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She became a participant in a larger game, one that might soon engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she turned into in contrast to every body that the aristocracy had ever seen. In an international full of pale, confronted, modest English roses, Anne became a thunderstorm, electric-powered, unpredictable, not possible to ignore. Her darkish hair, bold eyes, and short, sharp wit set her other than the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court docket of King Henry V. At the beginning, she played the position anticipated of her, a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon. However, even within the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too vibrant to snuff out. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the convenience of a local, and laughed with a confidence few ladies dared display. Guys noticed, women gossiped. The court buzzed quietly, approximately the hanging Berlin woman. It wasn't lengthy before she caught the most risky attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII became no stranger to flirtation. His court became a playground of whispered guarantees and mystery liaison. However, Anne became exclusive. She failed to swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his fingers like so many others had. She teased. She challenged. She refused. Henry, a person used to on-the-spot adoration, turned into captivated. The more Anne held him at finger's length, the deeper he fell. Letters surpassed between them, packed with decorations of affection, frustration, longing. Henry provided her the function of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial function at courtroom. Anne astonishingly said no. She would not be just every other conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he would need to make her his spouse. It became a chance so audacious that it bowled over the courtroom. In any case, the king become already married, his queen Catherine, become cherished through the human beings and fiercely covered by using her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would ought to be defied for Henry to say Anne. However, Anne didn't balk. She had lived inside the courts of Europe, in which queens wielded tender energy from in the back of lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous recreation, but it was a sport she intended to win. Status within the candle-lit halls of the English courtroom, Anne Boleyn made her preference, now not to be simply favourite, however to change her destiny and England's forever. What commenced as an excessive flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn quickly spiralled right into a national disaster. Henry wasn't simply besotted. He became obsessed, and in his obsession, he changed into inclined to tear apart everything England had acknowledged for centuries. The king's preference to marry Anne hit a small snag. Particularly, he changed into already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step apart. She had been Henry's trustworthy spouse for too many years, and inside the eyes of God and the English human beings, she became the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it became nearly unthinkable. However, Henry became determined. He convinced himself, and tried to convince absolutely everyone else, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, because she had once been married to his brother Arthur. By no means thoughts that the Pope had granted special permission for their union years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul changed into damned until he annulled the wedding. Anne, for her part, knew better than to seem too eager. She saved herself just out of attain, alternately encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Each glance, each word turned into measured. She wasn't merely aiming for marriage. She became positioning herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted into whispers and factions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne's prefer, seeing the winds of strength shifting. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine, horrified at the idea of Anne replacing her. Diplomats wrote determined letters back to Rome. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation. Henry's very own advisors shifted uneasily, sensing the floor trembling below their feet. As months was years, Henry's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, maneuvered his legal professionals into finding loopholes, and slowly started out to recognize that the Church would now not bend effortlessly. Catherine had effective allies, together with her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful guy in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on, defying recommendation, lifestyle, and increasingly more the regulation itself. His courtship with Anne had grown to be something some distance more than private preference. It changed into now an undertaking to the very shape of Britain's political and religious existence. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's coronary heart. She became dragging a whole country into uncharted waters. A dangerous recreation had begun, and there can be no turning lower back. After nearly 7 agonizing years of maneuvering, scandal and diplomatic chaos, Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry V. A bold move, given that he became nonetheless technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and plenty of Europe. With the aid of June, Anne changed into topped Queen of Britain in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It need to have been the crowning moment of her existence, but the environment became a ways from universally glad. The humans of London watched with wary eyes. Some cheered, others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many puzzled if this new queen, together with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or a curse. Anne entered her queenship not as a cherished figure, but as a storm. Not like Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne became impressive, provocative, and politically savvy. She wore bold shades, commanded the court with sharp intelligence, and made effective enemies with breathtaking pace. Her role, even as reputedly relaxed, was also terrifyingly precarious. Everything rested on one component, supplying Henry with a male inheritor. Anne knew this as keenly as all of us. She became now not simply Henry's lover anymore. She became the wish of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry have been elated, certain the child might be boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave beginning to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked her crushing sadness with grace, insisting the subsequent baby could absolutely be a son. Henry, however, became less composed. His eyes, as soon as full of adoration, now flickered with doubt. Nevertheless, for a time, Anne's celebrity burned brightly. She reshaped the English court docket in her photograph, raising her family to unparalleled heights and turning into the first queen in English records. Crowned with the sacred oil normally reserved for kings, her have an effect on became good-sized. Overseas ambassadors sought her favour. Couriers reshuffled alliances to be in her appropriate graces. The once obedient Henry commenced shifting England formally away from Rome, developing the Church of Britain with himself at its head. All so that Anne's crown could not be wondered, but even in her triumph, dark clouds collected. Pals whispered in the back of their arms. Opponents rotated, ready, and Henry, fickle and restless, become already starting to look beyond the extremely good woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had gained the throne, but maintaining it might call for greater than appeal, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had climbed better than nearly any woman of her time. However, the better you rise, the harder the fall. Nearly from the instant she placed the crown on her head, the cracks in her world started out to show. At the heart of Anne's struggles become the stress to produce a male heir. Her first infant, Elizabeth, even though shiny and healthful, changed into not the son Henry V had hung his dynastic hopes upon, and the clock changed into ticking. Anne suffered multiple pregnancies in brief succession, but heartbreak followed. Miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each misplaced baby chipped away at the inspiration she had built. Henry, once passionately committed, started out to shy away, his sadness carving rifts between them. Anne, by no means one to go through in silence, argued, demanded, fought to maintain her location. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew uninterested in her sharpness. her defiance, the very fireplace that had as soon as drawn him in. Out of doors, the royal chambers, enemies were amassing like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted enamel now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters by no means forgave Anne for what they saw as robbery and sacrilege. Even commoners whispered against her, calling her the wonderful, blaming her for the schism with Rome and the heavy, past modifications that followed. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, demure. The entirety Anne changed into now not. Jane captured Henry's wandering interest simply as Anne's impact started to wane, in which Anne had dazzled him with brilliance and venture. Jane presented soothing compliance. It changed into a risky shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, saw it happening. She attempted to reclaim her role, lavishing attention on Henry, promising greater sons, begging for endurance. But the king, ever fickle, had already all started imagining lifestyles without the woman for whom he had as soon as torn a country aside. Anne's political enemies, together with Thomas Cromwell, as soon as her ally sensed the changing tide, they started out laying the foundation for a campaign of destruction, quietly accumulating accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The female who had performed the dangerous recreation of ambition so masterfully became now losing floor. Anne had won her crown through foxy and braveness, but in the brutal shifting world of Henry's court docket, past victories supposed little. Simplest clean fulfillment mattered, and Anne's enemies have been polishing their knives. The queen who had shattered a country might soon see how quickly a country should shatter her. Anne Boleyn's enemies didn't attack her with armies or swords. They got here with whispers, secrets and techniques, and thoroughly sharpened lies. In the back rooms of courtroom, betrayal was brewing. Silent, affected person, lethal. Thomas Cromwell, as soon as Anne's greatest best friend within the English Reformation, had become towards her. Their alliance had been constructed on mutual ambition. However, now their interests clashed. Anne wanted reforms to assist the negative and limit the energy of grasping nobles. Cromwell desired balance, want with Henry, and no interference. Anne's boldness had made her dangerous, and in Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into inflammation, suspicion, and bloodless detachment. Anne had few true buddies left. Even her charm, as soon as her best weapon, now grated in opposition to the court docket's hunger for a gentler, more pliable queen, and Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited simply out of sight, the appropriate comparison to Anne's fading fire. It turned into Cromwell who moved first. Understanding Henry changed into stressed, knowing that the king wanted and go out, but lacked a convenient excuse. Cromwell supplied a solution. What if Anne can be eliminated, not by way of divorce, which could humiliate Henry, however through shame? The accusations had been wild, sizable, even adultery, incest, conspiracy towards the king. Anne, the proud, top-notch queen, painted as a betrayer, a temptress, a hazard to the very crown she as soon as redefined. Cromwell carefully collected evidence, coaxing confessions underneath torture, twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, together with Anne's personal brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The fees made little experience. They were riddled with contradictions and impossibilities. But in Henry's courtroom, reality changed into whatever the king wanted it to be. Anne, sensing the tightening noose, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love that they had once shared, but it became no need. The man who had as soon as torn England aside for her now refused to fulfill her eyes. In May additionally 1536, Anne changed into arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the notable gate slammed shut behind her, she knew the reality. She changed into no longer a queen. She changed into a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the brutal sport she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her fate. And now by myself inside the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the very last flow. Anne Boleyn stood in the first-rate hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, lots of whom owed their very titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, prepared to erase the female who had as soon as modified the future of England. The fees towards her were shocking. Adultery with a couple of men, inclusive of her very own brother, George Boleyn, excessive treason, conspiracy towards the king. In any other global, such accusations against a queen might have been unthinkable. But here, now they were simply theatre, a grim performance designed to offer Henry V precisely what he wanted. Anne's downfall wrapped in a skinny veil of legality. Anne defended herself with the same hearth that had once gained Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she were crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of Britain. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. However, it turned into interested by not anything. The verdict were determined lengthy earlier than Anne set foot within the court. The trial became a spectacle for the court, and for the human beings, a public unmaking of as soon as unbreakable girl. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spoke damning phrases. Dates and places contradicted each other. Proof became flimsy whilst it existed at all. But the fact changed into irrelevant now. Anne turned into discovered guilty. Her brother George, and the opposite guys accused with her, were sentenced to demise as properly. Anne might be accomplished by way of beheading, a merciful sentence in comparison to the usual traitor's loss of life of striking, drawing, and quartering. Whilst the decision became reed and did not spoil, she stood tall, her face faded, however her spirit fiercely intact. In those very last moments earlier than being led lower back to her mobile, she spoke surely, asserting that she changed into organized to die, and prayed that God could have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doorways of the hall closed in the back of her, the court exhaled in alleviation. The storm Anne had been awesome, dangerous, unforgettable, changed into almost over. But even then they did not recognize. They had been now not erasing Anne Boleyn. They had been immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn became back to the Tower of London. Now not because the effective queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner watching for demise. Yet even going through the stop, Anne refused to collapse. Inside the bloodless, echoing halls of the tower, Anne organized herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the tough stone flooring, her hands clasped tightly, her voice consistent. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had devoted none. She was now not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her demise would deliver peace to the Dominion, and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, the ones few who had stayed dependable, wept in personal. Anne comforted them in preference to the opposite way round. She joked bitterly at instances that she could be remembered as a queen who had misplaced her head. In her darkish humour became the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry V, in the meantime, confirmed no signal of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date changed into finalized, Henry turned into arranging his next marriage. For Anne, this very last betrayal from the person who had once torn down a kingdom for her should were the private cut. On May additionally 18th, 1536, Anne became instructed she would die the following morning. She slept little that night time. As a substitute, she spent her very last hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and possibly for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. It changed into a small mercy, offered perhaps greater for the king's conscience than for Anne's consolation. At sunrise, Anne dressed cautiously for her very last moment. A dark grey gown of damask trimmed with fur, a red kirt under, colorations of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it under a simple cap, prepared to face the blade with grace. Because the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, best a final act of courage within the face of records' judgment. Her stop became close to, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May additionally 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold constructed in the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, some witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone partitions held their breath. Anne stood tall, her grey robe fluttering barely within the bloodless morning breeze. She seemed thinner than she had at courtroom, her face faded however calm. There had been no hysterics, no damaged sobs. If whatever, she faced dying with the identical fierce dignity. that had once shaken a state to its knees. She spoke in short, cautiously choosing her very last phrases. She did now not accuse. She did no longer shield herself. She prayed for the king's fitness and prosperity, the very guy who had abandoned her. In those final moments, Anne provided the world no longer a confession, but forgiveness. Her braveness shocked even folks who had come to peer her fall. The French executioner, introduced in particular to make sure a rapid dying improved. Anne knelt upright, her palms folded in prayer, her eyes lifted closer to the heavens. A small white material became tied around her eyes. She remained still. The sword flashed as soon as silent, rapid, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mom, history maker, turned into no greater. She became buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in a narrow chest, due to the fact no right coffin had been prepared for her. A queen as soon as crowned in gold now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's tale didn't end in that bloodless grave. Her daughter Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once disillusioned a king, would upward thrust to emerge as one of the greatest monarchs in English records. Elizabeth I, the virgin queen whose reign could see the flowering of English artwork, electricity, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn modified the direction of Britain forever. Her ambition helped trigger the spoil with Rome and the delivery of the Church of Britain. Her fall showed the world that even queens will be cast aside. But via her blood through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the long run, Anne Boleyn received a sort of immortality, not through her survival, however, through her indelible effect on records. Through the early 1770s, the Yankee colonies simmered like a pot left too long over a roaring fireplace. The relationship with Britain, once visible because the proud mother had soared into resentment, suspicion, and developing fury. It hadn't started out with tea. Years in advance, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists with the aid of placing taxes on the whole lot from newspapers to gambling cards. That was followed by using the Townshend Acts, taxing necessities like paper, glass, and paint. Each new regulation surpassed heaps of miles away through a parliament wherein the colonists had no illustration become like another spark touchdown in dry brush. At first, the anger showed itself in well-mannered petitions and fiery pamphlets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests, traders prepared boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson stuffed newspapers with passionate arguments about liberty and rights. However, as time wore on, frustration deepened into something darker, a slow attention that Britain wasn't listening. Worse, Britain did not care. Many colonists clung to the hope that if they just made sufficient noise, in the event that they simply reasoned tough sufficient, Parliament could repeal the taxes, and on occasion they did. The Stamp Act became famously repealed after loud colonial protest, but every small victory became observed with the aid of new regulation, new taxes, new insults. It wasn't about the money. It never absolutely became. The taxes themselves were modest by means of British standards. What infuriated the colonists was the principle. They have been being taxed without consent, dealt with as topics rather than residents, dominated like remote possessions as opposed to partners. Boston, more than every other city, have become the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery group of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British squaddies fired on unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Bloodbath. Blood had already stained the cobblestones, considered changed into a thing of the past. Via 1773, the colonies had been teetering on the brink. A very last insult might tip them into open defiance, and it got here no longer in the form of infantrymen or new laws or armies. However, within the quiet, reputedly harmless shape of crates stacked with tea. The colonists didn't understand it yet, but the night time that tea floated in the bloodless waters of Boston Harbor, the arena could exchange all the time. In 1773, Parliament made an essential miscalculation. Believing the Yank colonies could quietly accept cheaper tea, they exceeded the Tea Act, a law that was speculated to shock the struggling British East India Agency, and by the way reassert Britain's proper to tax the colonies. On paper, it gave the impression of a good buy. The Tea Act allowed the agency to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, slashing costs. and providing a luxury product at a bargain, a few pennies inexpensive. What ought to in all likelihood cross wrong? Everything. Due to the fact the problem wasn't the charge of tea, it became the principle in the back of it. The Tea Act left the hated tax on tea firmly in area. Accepting the tea, even at a reduction, would suggest acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. To many Americans, that was unthinkable. A give-up of the liberties that they had fought to shield for greater than a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread like wildfire through the colonies. Merchants fumed. They noticed their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would overwhelm nearby trade. Patriots raged on the hidden message. The Crown nevertheless believed it could do anything it thrilled. In Boston, the reaction became mainly fierce. Already a town scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of monetary hassle, Bostonians identified the Tea Act for what it turned into, a entice disguised as a good deal. Refusing the tea had become a count of honor, a litmus test for loyalty to the motive of liberty. Public meetings swelled. Newspaper columns burned with fiery rhetoric. Businesses like the Sons of Liberty, led through Samuel Adams and others, organized boycotts, vowing that no East India Enterprise tea might be unloaded, offered, or drunk on American soil. All across the colonies, ships carrying the debatable tea became a way via neighborhood resistance. In ports from the Big Apple to Charleston, the message changed into clean. We cannot be offered. But in Boston, destiny twisted in another way. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Ella Lenina, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored inside the harbor, and sat there refusing to depart. Royal officers insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A impasse grew, taut as a drawn bowring. The anxiety changed into unbearable. An unmarried act might damage it, and records might by no means be the identical again, because the British tea ship sat stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbor. The metropolis itself converted right into a powder keg. Every day that passed without resolution tightened the anxiety. Boston wasn't just resisting. It was getting ready for a fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by using fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved unexpectedly to organize resistance. They posted public notices calling on citizens to boycott British tea and held raucous conferences that swelled with farmers, artisans, and merchants alike, each accumulating delivered gas to the hearth. The Old South Assembly House became the nerve middle of the resistance. Heaps filled into the wood hall, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in defiance. Right here, resolutions had been exceeded, speeches were made, and tempers boiled. Every vote in opposition to the unloading of tea became every other hammer blow towards British authority. However, whilst the humans of Boston stood united, the clock became ticking. British law demanded that imported items like tea be unloaded and the tax paid inside 20 days. If the ships remained after the closing date, customs officers could capture the cargo and the tax could be gathered through force. The Sons of Liberty understood that after the tax changed into paid, even below protest, the precept could be lost. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It became approximately whether the colonies might receive being treated as subjects without rights, or whether they could stand and combat for his or her destiny. In the meantime, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading their cargo, stressful that the law be obeyed, colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down intended admitting that mobs, no longer monarchs, dominated the colonies. Boston's standoff had become a spectacle. Every guy, girl, and infant knew that something became coming. You can feel it inside the air, that cold, sharp sense earlier than a typhoon, whilst the arena holds its breath. All it might take became one spark to ignite an explosion, and someplace most of the crowded streets and crowded hearts of Boston, a choice changed into quietly taking form. A plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16th, 1773 dawned grey and cold over Boston, a metropolis balanced on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbour like ticking bombs. Now the final cut-off date had arrived. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a deliver's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officers could seize the shipment and British troops will be called in to enforce the regulation. All and sundry knew it. Everybody knew what was at stake. If the tea got here ashore, the principle was misplaced. If the colonists allowed it, even as soon as their cause, their declare to rights and liberty would unravel. That morning, lots of Bostonians and nearby colonists packed into the Old South Assembly residence, the largest constructing on the town. A few had walked miles through the icy nation state to be there. The meeting turned into so packed that men spilled out into the streets, straining to hear the fiery speeches echoing through the halls. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of Rise Up, presided over the collection. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out towards tyranny, to induce instantaneous action. However, even among the defiants, uncertainty hung heavy. What may be done without sparking outright conflict? How ought to they prevent the tea without beginning the floodgates to brutal retaliation? Because the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim information. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships could now not be allowed to depart without unloading. The tea could be seized, the tax accrued, the king's law enforced. The gang buzzed with fury. The walls of the assembly residence seemed to shudder with the force of it. Yet Samuel Adams stood lightly and spoke the phrases that signaled the quit of discussion. This meeting can do nothing greater to shock the user. A simple sentence, but everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Motion could be taken. Out of doors, a struggle would reduce through the gathering gloom. The sign. Guys disguised themselves quickly, smearing soot on their faces, donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling absolutely everyone. It became approximately creating an image, a message no one may want to mistake. The closing date had passed. Boston might answer, not with phrases, however, with defiance. As twilight deepened over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Figures moved through the shadows, everyday guys cloaked in difficult blankets. Their faces blackened with soot, a few embellished with feathers. They were not seeking to idiot anyone into believing they had been real Mohawks. Their hide changed into symbolic, an act of dropping their antique identities, of taking a stand as something new, something fierce. By way of the handfuls, they made their way to Griffin's Wharf, wherein the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbour water churned cold and darkish below them, thick with the pointy chunk of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken chaos. This was no longer a rebellion. It was a venture achieved with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and golf equipment, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few group participants nonetheless aboard. No harm got here to the sailors. They were disregarded, watched in silence because the operation started. Men split open the wood chests with practiced blows, the fragrant odour of sparkling tea spilling into the bloodless nighttime air. Others heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still waters of the harbour. Chest after chest, 342 in general, became broken and dumped until the black water swirled with thousands of kilos of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf, silent, aid. British guards stationed nearby made no circulate to intrude, whether or not from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains unclear. Some debts advise that even among British loyalists, there was an expertise. Something had shifted, and there could be no stopping it tonight. The discipline became high quality. No shipment changed into stolen. No one raided the ships for valuables. Most effective the tea, the hated image of British oppression, become targeted. In a town in which starvation and problem have been daily realities, the guys may want to have without problems turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They did not. When it became over, the harbour resembled a first-rate swirling cauldron packed with torn chests and soaking tea leaves. The odour of the sea mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea, filling the nighttime air with a strange, bittersweet, heady scent. The work became achieved. Silently, the guys disappeared into the nighttime, vanishing into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, handiest the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the ultimate damaged crates bobbed within the dark water, Boston stood none the less, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a rebel, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It changed into something a ways rarer, an act of bloodless, deliberate defiance accomplished under the cloak of night. The harbour was converted right into a large swirling teapot. Heaps of kilos of East India Organization tea floated in splendid mats at the water, staining it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, scooped handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbour, handiest to be chastised by using the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Not anything chained into to be salvaged. Nobody could take advantage of this night's work. This became precept, pure and simple. The metropolis woke the subsequent morning to the scent of salty tea hanging heavy inside the air. News unfold like wildfire. Word of mouth, letters, extensive sheets. By midday, absolutely everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had occurred, and reviews break up speedy. Among patriots there was satisfaction, a fierce, swelling satisfaction. That ordinary guys had stood up to the mightiest empire within the global and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was horror. To them, the destruction of property turned into reckless, risky. Had the colonies crossed a line they could not walk again from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, furious now not most effective on the destruction, however at the message it sent. If the king's authority may be defied so openly in Boston, in which else might revolt spark? British officers have been greatly surprised. They had anticipated protests, boycotts, maybe some other rebellion like those who had damaged out over the Stamp Act. They hadn't predicted prepared, disciplined revolutionaries to calmly damage tens of lots of kilos of royal property without a lot as breaking a window. The ship's captains, the Dartmouth, the Ella Lenina, the Beaver, ought to only watch helplessly as their cargo disappeared beneath the waves. Within the legitimate ledgers, the night's loss would be tallied at over 10,000 British kilos, a fortune, but the actual loss wasn't measured in pounds sterling or ruined tea. It changed into measured in accept as true with, in loyalty, within the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled her colonies with consent. The night time the tea sank, something deeper rose to the surface, a shared undeniable truth. The age of non-violent protest was ending. A reckoning turned into coming and Boston became equipped. Whilst word of the Boston Tea celebration crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the response became rapid and livid. To British officers, it became now not absolutely a protest. It was rise up, an open, mocking task to royal authority that could not be left out. King George III, upon listening to the information, becomes stated to have grown cold with anger. Parliament, already frustrated by way of years of colonial disobedience, exploded in outrage. They demanded punishment, now not just for the city of Boston, however, as a caution to all of the American colonies. The end result was a sequence of laws so harsh they have been fast nicknamed the Intolerable Acts in America. The primary blow came unexpectedly, the Boston Port Act. In one brutal stroke, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's bustling harbour, the financial lifeline of the metropolis, till the destroyed tea changed into paid for and order restored. Ships should no longer input or go away. Trade vanished. Goods and supplies dried up. Boston, once colourful and noisy, grew quiet, its docks eerily nonetheless. But the punishment didn't forestall there. The Massachusetts Authorities Act stripped the colony of its self-governing rights, putting it firmly under the king's appointed officials. The Management of Justice Act allowed royal officers accused of crimes to be tried lower back in Britain. A clean message that British government were untouchable. And to make certain the colonies knew pressure changed into an option. British soldiers have been quartered all through Boston, residing some of the very residents they had been supposed to subdue. The message was clean. Revolt would be beaten. Liberty become a luxurious the crown could no longer tolerate. However, Parliament's heavy hand had an unintentional effect. In preference to frightening the alternative colonies into submission, it outraged them. Information of Boston's struggling of its port closed, its humans ravenous beneath martial regulation, stirred deep sympathy and righteous anger at some stage in the USA. Wagon loads of food and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of assist, pledges of team spirit, and secret meetings started to weave the once fragmented colonies closer collectively. What had once been a Massachusetts problem turned into unexpectedly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain was hoping to make an example of them. Alternatively, they made Boston a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. The flames of revolution, as soon as flickering in isolated wallet, now commenced to blaze from colony to colony, and there would be no smooth extinguishing them. The punishment of Boston sent shock waves some distance past the rocky beaches of Massachusetts. Throughout the 13 colonies, outrage becomes something a long way greater risky for Britain. Solidarity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, bickering and competing, separated via geography, faith, and exchange rivalries. But when Parliament slammed Boston's harbour shut and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, people across the continent realized if it could show up to Boston, it can occur to everybody. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response changed into quick. Colonists sent wagons complete of meals, elements, and letters of team spirit to the struggling human beings of Boston. Town meetings buzzed with anger. Newspaper printers worked day and nighttime to spread the information. The combat changed into no longer Boston's alone. It turned into all of us's. And so, in September 1774, something unheard of took place. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the primary time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies collected below one roof to speak about a unified reaction. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, as soon as merely regional figures, now stood together as architects of a motion that changed into growing larger by way of the day. Their purpose, at least officially, became not but complete independence. Maximum nonetheless hoped for reconciliation, for a go back to the old courting of mutual admire under the British Crown. However, underneath the polite debates and carefully worded petitions, a deeper information turned into taking root. The colonies ought to not afford to face separately. On the Congress, they agreed to a sweeping boycott of British items. They pledged mutual guide in the face of, in addition, British aggression, and they made it clean any assault on one colony would be taken into consideration an attack on all. In taverns and assembly homes throughout the continent, ordinary humans commenced the use of words that had once been whispered most effective in non-public: unity, resistance, liberty. In bringing the hammer down on Boston, Britain had imagined it might weigh down rebellion. Rather, it had welded the colonies together into something a ways extra dangerous. A people who, regardless of their variations, were beginning to think of themselves not as scattered provinces, however as Americans. The winds of revolution were not simply stirring, they were collecting into a hurricane, and it became too past due for Britain to stop it. The night time the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't simply crates that had been destroyed. It became the illusion that the Yankee colonies may want to continue to be loyal topics forever. The Boston tea celebration lit a spark that no king, no military, no remote parliament should ever snuff out. Inside the months that observed, that spark stuck fire across the colonies. What had once been protests, boycotts, and well-mannered petitions hardened into open resistance. Metropolis militias started drilling openly, storehouses packed with powder and shot. Men who had as soon as toasted King George III in taverns now whispered about revolution under the equal roofs. Boston became an image of sacrifice, battered however unbowed. The more Britain tried to tighten its grip, the extra the colonies slipped through its fingers. Every ship that sailed past the closed, silent harbor of Boston turned into a silent reminder that tyranny had met its in shape in American defiance. Whilst Parliament exceeded the insupportable acts, they meant to make an instance out of Boston to scare the other colonies into submission. Alternatively, they had created a martyr metropolis, a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists realized that their fates have been tied together. Resistance turned into not about tea. It became about survival, identification, freedom. By the spring of 1775, the anxiety reached a boiling point outside Boston, inside the villages of Lexington and Concord. British troops dispatched to confiscate colonial weapons instead observed armed farmers. Normal guys geared up to defend their rights with musket fireplace. The primary shots of the Yank Revolution rang out, a right-of-way line traced lower back to the moment when guys chose precept over income and dumped a fortune's well worth of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party showed the arena that revolution would not always announce itself with trumpets and banners. From time to time it starts quietly with a small group of decided human beings' status inside the bloodless, deciding on defiance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting assaults. They had been rejecting an empire, and even though the road ahead might be bloody, sour, and unsure, one aspect had grown to be clear that night in Boston Harbor. The Yank colonies were now not unserving topics. They were something new, something risky. They were revolutionaries, and that they have been just getting began. All before the towering pyramids of Giza, before Mesopotamian towns buzzed with lifestyles, before Stonehenge stood against the sky, there has been coral. Hidden away in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, coral rose in silent majesty nearly 5,000 years ago, then faded into close to entire oblivion, swallowed with the aid of sands and forgotten by records. For centuries, the world did not even are aware of it existed. The first-rate valley, wherein Carol once thrived, appears at the start look an unlikely place for civilization to bloom. The panorama is parched, barren, the river little more than a skinny silver thread winding through rocks and dust. To maximum eyes, it appeared inhospitable, a place deserted by using lifestyles. Yet, it became right here, amid the desolation, that one of humanity's earliest remarkable cities took shape. Coral wasn't just a series of scattered huts or a temporary buying and selling post. It became a planned city sprawling over 150 acres filled with pyramids, plazas, residential quarters and ceremonial areas. It had scale, purpose and vision. A complex society blossoming centuries before the Egyptians started out stacking stones into pyramids of their very own. The human beings of Carol executed this without the wheel, without written language, without steel gear. They built large structures from stone and earth, with not anything but ingenuity, communal attempt, and the raw energy of human will. But for lots of years, Carol's lifestyles remained a secret. Even if travelers stumbled throughout the abnormal weathered mounds scattered throughout the valley, they mistook them for natural formations, mere hills sculpted by way of the desert winds. No one imagined that beneath the sand lay one of the oldest towns inside the International, predating even the civilizations that records books had crowned as the firsts. It wasn't till the overdue 20th century that archaeologists, led through Ruth Shady, uncovered the reality. What they located buried inside the dirt of time might rewrite the tale of the Americas and force the world to rethink what it thought it knew, approximately the birth of civilization itself. Carol had risen, flourished, and fallen in overall anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence, its stones are talking once more, whispering of a non-violent, wise people who built a world of complexity and marvel in a land where life itself regarded not possible. And this turned into only the beginning of their tale. In the beginning, look, the Sup Valley looks like a place wherein lifestyles need to battle to exist. Harsh winds sweep throughout endless stretches of sand and stone. The solar beats down mercilessly, drying out the earth, baking the panorama into cracked, brittle sheets. Water is scarce, the river a meandering thread, combating for survival. To the untrained eye, it's far a wasteland, barren, empty, forgotten with the aid of the gods. However, the human beings of Coral noticed something exceptional. They did no longer see a desert to be feared. They saw a canvas to be formed. They identified the river, but modest, because the lifeblood of possibility. And so, with persistence, ingenuity, and sheer willpower, they became this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of existence and way of life. Their first victory turned into agriculture. They found out to tame the river's seasonal floods, building simple, however high, quality irrigation structures that channeled water throughout the valley ground. Where others noticed sand and dirt, they coaxed inexperienced shoots of wish, cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton specially became their treasure. It spun into fishing nets and textiles, fueling change with coastal villages and creating bonds that stretched some distance beyond their desolate tract home. But developing plants changed into simplest a part of their mastery. The human beings of Coral understood that survival in the desert required stability. They labored with nature, no longer against it. They built their homes and plazas from stone and earth designed to resist each sizzling heat and the rare, punishing rains that now and again swept through the valley. They studied the celebrities and seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the veins and arteries of Coral's financial system. Dried fish, cotton, end result. and homemade goods flowed up and down the coast. In exchange, Carol received wonderful goods: colorful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, thoughts from remote peoples. They had been no longer isolated. They have been related. In a land where survival regarded impossible, Carol thrived through intelligence, innovation, and network. They failed to triumph over the wilderness with brute force. They partnered with it, gaining knowledge of its rhythms, respecting its electricity, constructing a society that became no longer just useful. It becomes superb. Towards the odds, Carol blossomed into a beacon of civilization, and it was handiest starting to rise, growing out of the wasteland like ancient guardians. The pyramids of coral defy the whole lot we thought we knew about early civilization within the Americas. These were not small, crude systems built by means of primitive fingers. They were massive, deliberate works of architecture created via human beings with imaginative and prescient organization and ambition. The center piece of the town changed into the Pyramid Maya, the most important of Coral's monumental systems. It stretched extra than 450 ft in length and towered nearly 60 ft above the wilderness ground, a feat of engineering on par with the early wonders of the historic global. Built from stone, mud, and woven reed luggage packed with rocks, the pyramid became designed not just to bear the tough weather, however to resist the punishing earthquakes that on occasion rattled the area. And endure it did, standing silent towards wind and time for almost 5 millennia. But the pyramids of Carol were now not tombs. In contrast to the huge burial complexes of Egypt, Carol's pyramids served a special motive. They have been centers of ceremony, strength, and public lifestyles. Temples and collecting areas topped their summits, on hand through extensive, stylish staircases. Fires as soon as burned at pinnacle, these structures and rituals had been held under the countless Peruvian sky. On the foot of the pyramids, vast plazas spread out, sunken and circular, inviting hundreds to accumulate for religious ceremonies, political meetings, and communal celebrations. The very design of Carol's cityscape cautioned a society that prized network and order, a humans deeply related to one another and to the cosmos. Around the pyramids, smaller residential complexes fanned out, in all likelihood home to monks, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The pyramids themselves seem to have been strategically located, aligned with celestial activities, sunrises, solstices, the cycles of the stars. To the human beings of Coral, architecture wasn't simply realistic, it became spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. Taking walks the various weathered stones nowadays, it is nearly impossible no longer to experience an unusual experience of awe. These structures had been raised without steel gear, without the wheel, without beasts of burden, but they rose with symmetry, scale, and mind-blowing precision. The great pyramids of Coral have been not constructed for arrogance, nor for battle. They were constructed to attach earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity, and they nonetheless whisper across the sands, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. A number of the ruins of Coral. There is something profoundly extraordinary, something that sets it other than so many ancient civilizations. No guns had been found buried below its sands. No shielding partitions circle its plazas. No mass graves trace at bloody conquest or internal strife. Not like the kingdoms that rose and fell through conflict, Carol become a society built on peace. It's a revelation that defies expectancies. Here became a civilization that flourished not through violence, but via cooperation, alternate, and shared belief. The people of Coral appear to have invested their electricity, now not in armies or fortresses, however in architecture, astronomy, track, and communal existence. Their plazas and pyramids were not monuments to victory over enemies. They were centers of celebration, worship, and governance. This turned into a civilization that chose to acquire in place of overcome, to negotiate rather than spoil. Change became the lifeblood of Carol's achievement. Cotton grown along the fertile river banks turned into spun into fishing nets that had been traded with coastal groups. In return, Carol received dried fish, an important supply of protein, and wonderful goods from a long way away locations. Colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, or even rare tropical fruits from remote valleys. This huge network of alternate stitched the region collectively, binding some distance, flung communities into a peaceful net of mutual benefit, and inside the center of it all, Carroll thrived as a cultural and monetary hub. Religious and ceremonial existence played a vital position in retaining social concord. The town's grand public spaces and sunken plazas in all likelihood served as levels for rituals that united the human beings under shared religious beliefs. Music filled those gatherings, flutes carved from condor bones, drums made from deer hides, developing soundscapes that echoed throughout the barren region, tying person lives to something greater. Management, too, seemed to depend much less on military power and greater on spiritual authority and civic agency. The metropolis's leaders should have coordinated large creation initiatives, seasonal agricultural cycles, and complicated change agreements, all without leaving behind the brutal scars of conflict. In an historical global so regularly defined by battle, Coral stands as a shining exception, a reminder that civilization does not shoot upward thrust at the broken backs of the conquered. It is able to instead be built by the quiet strength of collaboration, creativity, and agree with. At Carroll, the stone nonetheless appeared to hum with echoes of an international long, long gone. It turned into no longer only a metropolis of homes and exchange. It changed into a town alive with sound, ceremony, and non-secular rhythm. Track and ritual have been woven into the very heartbeat of Carroll civilization. Archaeologists digging carefully via the dry sands and blanketed a treasure trove of ancient devices, flutes crafted from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles common from deer antlers, small drums stretched with animal hides. These artifacts had been not simple toys. They were crafted with care, tuned to precise notes, designed to hold sound across the extensive open plazas of the town. In an international without written language, tunes spoke the language of the soul. Believe it, the low thrum of drums growing at nightfall, flutes keening just like the wasteland wind, for stamping on the sunken plazas as loads collected under the fading mild. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid systems. Priests wearing difficult woven clothes could chant to the gods of the river, the earth, the stars. In those moments, Carroll was no longer only a town. It changed into a symphony. The format of Coral itself indicates that ritual lifestyles changed into at its middle. The grand plazas have been now not mere open areas. They have been degrees for communal ceremonies, cautiously designed to attract people together. The sunken circular courts acted like historic amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight onto the rituals done at their facilities, and above them all, the pyramids loomed, now not as tombs, but as sacred mountains built through human palms, linking the earth to the heavens. Rituals probably marked the turning of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, the movements of the stars. Track became not simply leisure. It turned into a bridge between people, among nature and the divine, between the regarded and the mysteries beyond. No violent murals, no terrifying gods of warfare, no bloodthirsty sacrifices. In Coral, the religious world seems to have been certainly one of harmony, birthday celebration, and reverence. Even nowadays, while the barren region wind whistles through the ruins, you could almost pay attention to it. The faint lines of historical music, the forgotten songs of a folks who located splendor, meaning and connection inside the coronary heart of the cruel, infinite sands. Carroll wasn't just a place of song change and formality. It turned into a surprise of engineering, a testimony to human ingenuity in one of the most harsh landscapes on the earth. Without steel tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, the human beings of Carroll shaped a city of stone and earth that has endured nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements had been astounding. Large pyramids rose from the desert floor, constructed not with small, fragile bricks, but with tremendous stones carried throughout the dry valley. Workers transported rocks the usage of reed baggage, inventive baskets robust enough to undergo heavy hundreds woven from the very vegetation that grew along the river banks. Layer upon layer they built with care, stacking stone and filling the interiors with rubble to create systems that could face up to no longer handiest time, however, nature's fury. And that they understood nature properly. Coral lies in a vicinity at risk of violent earthquakes, yet their pyramids and plazas survived in large part intact. How? Through studying earthquake-resistant structure, builders used bendy production strategies, layered fills, huge foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to take in and expend seismic strength. It became engineering born no longer from textbooks, however, from an intimate information of the Earth itself. Water management changed into every other silent triumph. Despite dwelling in a desolate tract, the humans of Carroll evolved sophisticated irrigation structures. Channels and canals carefully guided river water to their agricultural fields, permitting vegetation to flourish even all through dry seasons. No water became wasted. Every drop mattered. The format of Coral itself contemplated super-city-making plans. Essential systems aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting a deep information of the solar cycles. The sunken plazas with their unique geometry were more than gathering places. They had been devices for monitoring the heavens, allowing monks and astronomers to expect seasons essential for survival. Even the city's company spoke of a complex society. Residential zones, administrative regions, ceremonial centers, all had been arranged in harmony, balancing communal life with sacred areas. They constructed no longer just for the instant but for generations. Nowadays, as current engineers surprise at Coral's resilience, they're reminded that greatness isn't always measured by using generation alone. Now and again, the innermost expertise lies in understanding the forces of nature, in running with the land, no longer against it. Coral's stones have continued storms, quakes, and the erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent testament to a civilization that engineered their goals into the desolate tract sands. For hundreds of years, the town of Carroll flourished, a beacon of peace, trade, and architectural mastery inside the desert sands. After which, quietly, nearly without a hint, it turned into abandoned. No fires marked its fall. No symptoms of conquest scar its walls. No mass graves or shattered monuments tell a tale of surprising disaster. As an alternative, Coral surely dwindled. Its plazas emptied, its pyramids left to the drifting sands, its flutes and drums silenced by way of time. Why did they leave? That question nevertheless lingers like a ghost throughout the brilliant valley. Some students agree with that environmental exchange struck, the very last blow. Proof suggests that a long length of drought can also have crippled Coral's agriculture. Without the river's lifestyles, giving waters, the fields could have withered. Exchange networks dependent on surplus cotton and food could have faltered. The cautious balance Coral had maintained with its harsh surroundings may additionally have in the end tipped past repair. Other theories point to shifting change routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new centers of strength emerged alongside the coast and inland, Carroll's influence might have diminished. Perhaps the products they once supplied, cotton, fish produce, have been no longer enough to maintain their function as a dominant city. Slowly, the lifeblood of commerce drained away. Still others whisper of internal decline. Without written records, we will simplest consider political struggles, religious upheaval, or easy exhaustion after centuries of boom. Even peaceful societies can fracture below stress, whilst survival will become unsure. Whatever the motive, the departure appears to us slow, not surprising. Households in all likelihood drifted away one by one, searching for greater fertile valleys, more potent rivers, new beginnings. Children who as soon as ran across Coral's plazas grew up telling stories of a lost town at the back of them. Tales that would eventually fade into legend. The desolate tract reclaimed what human beings had constructed. Winds carried best sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried under shifting dunes. What had once been a buzzing, vibrant civilization became an area of silent, slumbering mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Coral remained hidden, a whisper below the sands ready. Nowadays, as archaeologists carefully uncover its stones, the query still burns. How does a town so advanced, so fantastically crafted, absolutely vanish? Possibly the fact is that even the finest civilizations, no matter how smart or peaceful, are nevertheless fragile, threads woven into the tapestry of time, for all time prone to the unseen forces of alternate. For millennia, Carroll lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the excellent valley. Tourists surpassed the abnormal rounded hills that dotted the panorama, by no means suspecting that beneath their lay the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, those had been simply herbal formations, mounds shaped with the aid of the wind and time. It wasn't until the past due 20th century that the arena would sooner or later listen Carroll's voice once more. Within the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a crew into the Soup Valley, driven by means of curiosity and a growing experience that these hills may keep secrets no one had but uncovered. What they determined could rewrite the tale of human civilization inside the Americas. Layer through painstaking layer, the sand became brushed away. Under it emerged partitions of cautiously reduced stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids, a town far older than each person should have imagined. Radioarbon dating showed the improbable. Coral become over 600 years old, thriving at the identical time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It became a discovery that shook the rules of archaeology. Before Carroll, pupils believed that civilization within the Americas advanced tons later, shadowed by means of the first-rate empires of the vintage global. Coral changed the entirety. It proved that the Americas had birthed enormous architecture, complex city life, and social agency independently long before the upward push of the Incas or the Mer. Ruth Shady and her group observed not simply stone and rubble, however the remnants of lifestyles, musical gadgets, fishing nets, textiles, historical knot records, and even services made to the gods. Every artifact advised a tale of individuals who had built a society with imaginative and prescient intelligence and profound creativity. Carroll's rediscovery was greater than an academic triumph. It turned into a resurrection. A civilization that had slept underneath the wasteland for lots of years now stood discovered under the open sky all over again. Its plazas kissed by means of the equal winds that had once carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of children. These days, Carroll is recognized as a UNESCO World Background Site, a delicate, valuable link to humanity's earliest desires of constructing, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Coral well. However, ultimately, the stones continued, awaiting someone to concentrate, to see, to take into account. Carroll stands nowadays as a silent large, a reminder that civilization's roots stretch a long way deeper than we as soon as believed. Among its pyramids and plazas, the historical stones whisper a tale that reshapes our expertise of humanity's adventure, a story not of conquest and bloodshed, however of concord, ingenuity, and hope. Long earlier than the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or maybe Egypt, the humans of Coral were building something notable. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They mapped the celebs without written statistics. They created a thriving society rooted in change, song, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving scars of struggle upon the land. In a generation regularly described by way of conflict, Coral offers another vision of what civilization may be. A society that valued connection over conquest, understanding over domination. It reminds us that complexity does no longer require violence. That greatness isn't always measured via what number of armies march throughout a battlefield, but by means of how a community comes collectively to construct, to create, to dream. Carroll's legacy reaches a long way beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges antique assumptions that civilization had a single cradle, that urban existence and huge architecture belonged first to the old world. Carroll proves that humanity's spirit of innovation and aspiration arose independently in many corners of the earth, shaped via extraordinary hands, but pushed through the same eternal wants to endure, to have a good time, to reach toward the divine. Nowadays, strolling amongst Coral's weathered ruins, you may almost pay attention it. The pulse of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of investors bargaining in the plazas, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky of countless stars. Their lives, their goals, their testimonies are nonetheless with us, etched into the bones of the earth. Carroll teaches us that even if civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, snoozing underneath sands, ready to be remembered, waiting to inspire once more. Within the awesome timeline of human records, Coral shines now not just as a relic of the beyond, however as a beacon for the destiny, a reminder that even in the most harsh deserts, even underneath the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder know how, and peace can take root and build an international that reaches for the celebs.